Yeah, I'm Alex Sifford. Guy Sievert here, who's a member of the Neskowin Regional Water District Board, is my chaperone. But full disclosure, he's also the other part of E-System Services. And we've done work before Neskowin, helping Lincoln City, which some of you are familiar with. They identified a parcel in their Schooner Creek watershed and tried to get some OWEB money to buy it to begin with, and they weren't successful there, but they ultimately did acquire it. We've also worked with some other systems, one in particular, Cottage Grove, where they really had no hope of buying any of their upstream lands, but we tried to leave them with the collaborative partnership to work with those landowners, which were Industrial Timber and Bureau of Land Management, surprisingly, Forest Service. I'll tell you one takeaway from that job in particular that's somewhat related here, and that is in terms of source water protection, is for any water system anywhere to build as much treated storage as they can. Because as we've all seen, whether it's a fire or lack of power or whatnot, if you've got a few days of treated water storage, you can ride out quite a few things. Cottage Grove was alarming to me because they had very little treated water storage. It was like, okay, we'll work on source water, but well, on the other hand, why don't you float a bond issue and build some tanks? So, Neskowin, we're at the far end of South Tillamook County. This is the short and sweet of my whole presentation. So, we're trying to buy 1,500 acres east of town, most of which is owned by Weyerhaeuser. It used to be, until recently, owned by Hancock. We had great discussions with them, and then they did a giant land swap with Weyerhaeuser, and now we're talking to new owners. They are, however, very willing to talk, and that's where it all begins. What we did last year, again with the help of our partner NCLC, is bought the first 51 acres. We've got a small private woodlot owner who was willing to sell, number one. Number two, they were willing to entertain the idea of could they donate part of it. So that's what helped cement the deal with us. Why are we doing this? Again, we heard earlier that it started with a source water assessment and then an updated one. And again, some of the risks in our watershed are very minor. It's road building and logging activities from forest management. We have one small quarry for those roads, but by and large, there aren't any other activities occurring in the watershed. And we've always approached this as a scaled down version of what folks in New York City learned years ago, and that is if they could manage some of their lands way in upstate New York, it'd be a lot less than building billion-dollar treatment systems for the city of New York. So scale that down to everybody here in the room. If we can do a little bit more on the treatment naturally, then we have less infrastructure to build. And the other thing that has come up with the questions earlier is about on long term. We're in this to definitely manage it so that subsequent administrations can't mess with it. And we looked at all the means listed here: deed restrictions, conservation easements, purchase. Our watershed that we're talking about is so small, relatively speaking, that we kind of gone right to purchase. With the rainforest watershed, rainforest here, something of that scale, then conservation easements pay off, or they stand a much better chance to work. But if it's small enough, we've gotten pursued the approach to buy it. But again, we need to do that with partners and supporters. So first off, we're pretty much due west of Salem. Neskowin is a small coastal village originally, and then now historically in the last 30 years we've built more homes east of 101 and up in the hills. Again, this is a common occurrence anywhere in the Oregon coast. You've run out of the land in the tsunami zone, so we're moving up.
We're going to the slides.
So Hawk Creek drains into Neskowin Creek, which comes in from the south. And our water treatment plant is at the end of a little canyon that's at the end of a meadow that used to be a golf course, and prior to that, a dairy. And again, quite a few people in Neskowin are really unaware, blissfully unaware, of where their water comes from. And in fact, geographically, we look up this canyon, and then the river takes a slight turn north and then further east. And so most people just see this thing of hills and say, oh yeah, whatever. However, we've done quite a bit in the outreach to get people to know that a little better. The district serves about 800 customers, 795 of which are residences. We have very few commercial enterprises in town. The source is Hawk Creek. We proudly say it's one of the best ones in the Oregon coast. In spite of the industrial timber that's gone on, it's actually still been very well managed. We treat it at a treatment plant that is a membrane filter, so it's pretty modern technology. We disinfect it and add some hypochlorite and some additional stuff to adjust the pH. And again, the source water assessment is what really started driving things with the original one, which is what I think 05 or 06. And then it was updated again in 15. But the high soil erosion potential is, again, not uncommon to everywhere in the Oregon coast. So you have steep slopes that are pretty close to the coastal plain. So again, the other thing that we thought is that our long-term solution, ideally, start with Dream Large, would be to buy it. I'm wondering if you can click on the link here, and we can show 1 minute of a aerial. One of my first suggestions to everybody is get some drones and get up and fly your watershed. Cheap. We did it with a local guy who volunteered, and if we can get part of it, great, and if we can't, the link will be in the materials that you folks can access later. But again, when so many people live on a little itty bitty coastal strip and they have no idea about what's just due east of us, drone footage really helps. Real simple.
I don't know if sound will go through, but let's see.
There's very little sound to worry about if there is, and if you can just, if it does come through, we can blow it up and just show a minute or so at the beginning of it. So we're flying over the homes that are built where they didn't think about tsunamis at the time. And then we're looking up this canyon here, which is the Hawk Creek Canyon. And again, you get to see the different levels of industrial harvesting that have gone on. This is a big chunk of U.S. Forest Service land that we have. So there is one chunk in the watershed we're not concerned about. But as you can see here, and this was taken not too long ago, but we've got some, very recent harvests, and then a little regrowth, and then some more recent harvests. We can stop that. This goes on for quite a while, but folks, I encourage you when you get a moment to see one example of what I think is really cheap education. And it's even better yet if you do know, and probably all of us have in the community, is some sort of drone nut who says, I'd love to. Let's do this. It shouldn't cost you too much. Okay, so once again, the treatment plant at the end of this canyon, and everybody else is blissfully unaware of the other 1,500 acres. And yes, they contain fish. So it's a lot of ESH habitat, enhanced endangered salmon habitat, plus steelhead, plus trout. And again, even in this somewhat dated photo, you get an idea of the recent harvests. So within that, we have this checkerboard, if you will, of land ownership. And what the water district did is that a number of these smaller properties are owned by some small woodlot owners, family foresters. And they were the first ones. We've been talking to every landowner for the last decade, but they were the first ones who said, you know what, I'm doing some estate planning. It's always a good trigger, folks. And saying, maybe I will sell you some of that land. And so we said, terrific. The parcel we would really like to buy is this first one down in the bottom, which is right where two forks of the creek come together. And for us, that was kind of a linchpin, a real foundational piece to get if we could. So that is what the district just acquired this last year. We are now in negotiations with the owners of these two properties and about a third of the remaining ones. So in an ideal world, in a year or so or less, we'll own just at least the first immediate lower slope parcels. And again, the only one that has any remote development potential are these three parcels just immediately upstream of the water treatment plant. Now, while they're zoned for development, that doesn't mean that it can happen easily. And that's part of the negotiations with a lot of landowners, is saying, yeah, sure, you are zoned for, I think it's rural recreation, but you got to get water, power, sewer, something up there if you're gonna even have glamping. It doesn't matter. And so they say, oh yeah, I guess it isn't just, raw gold. That helps in negotiations at least get the price down a bit. However, again, our real goal is to get all of this. And what's interesting is that the very uppermost part of this corner of the watershed is actually, think of it as a plateau in terms of it, after the steep slopes up above there's a pretty flat area. And it's actually very much a groundwater recharge point. It has been harvested. There's even beaver activity. It's kind of interesting. We've got a lot of beaver activity down near town, and there's kind of a gap, and then there's some more beaver activity way up the top of the watershed. First off, just a way of beating the drums of the water district. And full disclosure, I was on our water district board for 20 years. And this was just pie in the sky at the time. We kept talking about it. But first thing we did is we said, well, if there's things we can do to help improve the fish habitat, then we will. And so our water intake, like a lot of water system intakes, was pretty crude. And it had very minor jumps for juvenile fish barriers. So to me, it was pretty pristine, but yes, it could be improved. What happened is the water district, working with first the local watershed council, the Neskowin and Sand Lake Watersheds Council, we started with them and then said, you know what, maybe the better partner in this actually is going to be Tillamook Estuaries Partnership to handle this kind of a job. So what they did is got some OWEB funding, and then the district put in funding. I think the district put in about 60 grand. It was a 300 grand project. What they did, again, to me as a skeptic, was that they dug out the channel and then they put in these concrete blocks, which were very much well reinforced footings and then just vertical barriers with a notch designed for, again, the low flow foul wag or the river channel. Put those in, backfilled them, threw in a couple of logs, and by God, that thing works great. And it's made it very fish friendly and still allows the system to operate as well. I've taken a more recent photo here, but in fact this is all so vegetated now with willow and small alder. You can't see the project too well unless you're in the creek. Anyway, this is great stepping stone, if you will, to work with partners on some sort of restoration project. And that was done back in '09. Since then, what we've been doing on this particular project is always continuing to talk with the landowners. Our general manager, the prior one and our current one, are absolutely on a first name basis. They want to call up someone and say, hey, how's it going? You coming to town these days? You want to have coffee? We also hired, again, starting with a little assistance from the local watershed council, an outfit called Trout Mountain Forestry out of Corvallis and Portland. And they came in and just did a very high elevation, literally high elevation view of the land. Then they went out on the land, and then they did some estimations just on the reproduction that was going on what's the value and the age and the type of the timber. Again, like a lot of North Coast areas, Swiss needle cast came through. And so to their credit, most of the landowners, all the landowners, private or small or large, have been replanting with a mix of cedar, hemlock, and spruce, and not putting in the Doug fir that was subject to the Swiss needle cast disease. So the species selection on all the reproduction is great. Got a lot of alder that comes in on its own. And that gave us a little bit of a starting point saying, this is what we think it would cost if you wanted to value all the land there. And again, had we had the money in 2012, it would be half of what timberland on the North Coast is worth today. Timberland is just crazy expensive. Even freshly cut over timberland, stupidly expensive. On the other hand, a lot of people have gotten rich in the last 10 years. A lot of people. And so even though the price is higher, we want to remain confident that we can approach some people with way too much money in their back pocket that want to do the Lord's work, if you will. So what we've done a lot of in the last 3 years is going after some grants aggressively, bugging Julie, bugging others, and using the money to do a couple of things. First off is to see if we couldn't appraise the land And secondly is, once we acquire it, how about a timber management plan? And again, folks here, some of you have heard the Arch Cape story, so we're following somewhat in their footsteps. And again, we're very willing to admit that we'll copy anybody that's successful. So, working with the Conservancy in particular, starting in 2021, that thus allowed people who want to make a donation to make a tax deductible. And so a couple of the first big donations were $50,000 and $10,000. And that was matched by the county, by the district's $40,000 to come up with our $100K purchase price for the first property. And that is roughly half of what the property is worth. And it's been cut over, I want to say 7 to 10 years ago, but growing back wonderfully. But that gives you an estimate. I mean, if it's $4,000 an acre of crap land, what used to be crap land, it's amazing. But on the other hand, that just, as a friend said facetiously many years ago, well, just go make more money. Well, it's pretty easy to say, but even so, we have to have your eyes open in terms of how much it costs to buy land in the Oregon coast, because one reason is simply it is such productive timberland. Weyerhaeuser, and before them Hancock, and before them Green Diamond, they weren't in this because they like green trees. They were in it to make money. And you can make money still on commercial timberland, although when you buy it at $5,000 an acre, you gotta be patient. And at the same time, I should back up and say one reason that's also been an impetus is that in our lifetime, and more importantly in about the last 20 years, the harvest rotation cycle's gone down. It's now not uncommon for the REITs, the real estate investment trusts that own the lands, to say, great, we're on a 35-year cycle. They're growing what used to be called pecker poles in the industry. They're very thin, small diameter, but they do grow fast and they do have value. But the point is that to put on the Wayback Machine for a moment, I worked with some guys in Crown Zeller back in the 80s when we were doing wood energy projects, and they were complaining that they were dropping from an 85-year rotation to a 65-year rotation. And to remind folks, the whole reason that the timber industry versus the lumber industry has changed is because some smart guys, in the case of Crown Zellerbach, who was a guy from a bandit from England named Jimmy Goldsmith, he said, wow, if you're valuing that at 65-year rotation, if I value it at 35-year rotation, that suddenly is worth a lot more than your stock, and I'm gonna buy you out. And that's what happened with a number of lumber companies. So, back to what we had good fun in last year, and that was a lot of negotiation with this landowner, who, even though they're willing, a ton of back and forth. Our general manager, on a good relationship with this owner, still, we did not one, not two, but 3 appraisals. Because every time you paused for a while, there's an IRS stipulation that says the appraisal's only good for 60 days. So most of us would just say, great, I'm going to look at the lumber market then, the lumber market now, I'm gonna go up 2% or down 5%, and we'll call it good. No, you're gonna hire the appraiser again. And he's gonna do that same little trick. But you have to do that if your landowner wants an IRS deduction, a tax-free donation. The other thing we're doing though is we're appraising the other property for purchase, the closest ones. We've hired a forester for the forest management plan, and again, we're trying to get as much as we can out of him for the entire watershed. He specifically was hired to look at the parcel that we acquired, but again, you're not going to look at it in a vacuum. So we're trying to get as much free work out of them as possible on looking at the entire parcels. We're also looking at additional funding where we can. Again, thank you, DEQ and OHA. And then finally, I'm beating it, but continuing the discussions with the owners, saying, what if? Guy mentioned earlier the private forest accords. When that whole process was happening, was provided an opening for us to talk with Weyerhaeuser, the newer owners. And again, they've been pretty upfront with us too, saying, we'll consider it. You will pay us not market price, above market price, if we can do a deal. And again, that's their fiduciary interest to their shareholders. We may not like it, but at least they're saying, we'll talk to you. So as we go forward, we're trying to do is, A, maintain momentum. There we go. Oh, and now we're gonna go way too fast. Okay. So our timberland management plan is a first fun one, and again, we've looked at what others are doing. We're always looking at what others are doing. And at Arch Cape, I noticed they had a series of public meetings about what people should think about. Our general manager is more of a kind of a top-down approach guy. He says, we'll take care of it. We'll get this plan well written before we offer it up to first the board and their approval, and then the general public. But it's not to say it's being done in a vacuum so much as we're saying we think everybody is still rowing in the same direction in this. Partners. Love our friends at NCLC. Again, they've been in the Neskowin area. They were given some land, just one little mini basin over them. It's called Butte Creek. So John and the others were familiar with Neskowin by owning about 32 acres there. It's a lovely little tributary that we don't drink out of, but we do use it. Outreach. So number of lucky unincorporated areas in Tillamook County get to go through what they call their citizens advisory committees. And these are actually a really good venue for us to get the word out because we are unincorporated. We don't have a city hall, we don't have city council meetings. However, we have these informational town halls that we've put together on all the land use goals. And part of this is to update our community plan, but we took full advantage of it to say, great, for at least one of those meetings, we're gonna talk ad nauseum about our plans for the watershed. So this was the cast of characters we trotted out, again, including folks that are familiar up here at the North Coast, the Springboard Forestry, for example, and Phil formerly at the Arch Cape. But again, when you get the materials, if you're so inclined, please do click on the link, and there's an hour-and-a-half presentation on everything about our watershed at the time. But we're continuing to do the outreach, and that's key. We're also trying to do our networking with our good friends, some of whom I just mentioned, and some of whom, more importantly, are in the room. So the DEQ and OHA water protection programs have been great. We brought, before we got too far down the road, we had one of the authors of our source water assessment, Josh Seeds, come and talk to the Water District Board. We also had folks like EcoTrust come and talk to the board, and at least one of our local banks, when we said, hey, what if we wanted to just go to UBank and borrow the money and buy it? To which, at the time, about 1% or 2% interest rates, it was like, sure, they'll give us the money. Again, we have 800 ratepayers. Doesn't take much of a mathematician to say if you want to buy an $800,000 property, then that's $1,000 per ratepayer. Figure out how you're going to pay for it. Now make it $8 million. That's even challenging, more challenging. However, we're looking at everything we can in terms of federal funding, private forest funding, the new private forest accord programs. We're following those. On the face of it, they might have some acquisition money next year. Both Guy and I are very familiar with the OWEB programs. I used to run our local watershed council, so we were very familiar with the OWEB grants, land acquisition grants. Not to be too cynical, but there is no such thing as a free grant. So when you want to go get grant money, you have to understand the cost. The other thing I'd like to point out to people is the scale. Hey, going for $100,000 is, going for $10,000 is almost ridiculous. 100, yes. Ideally, how about $1 million? Because you're going to find out you're going to put a lot of the same level of effort to get $1 million as you would for 100,000. Regardless, we are trying to track other districts and say, how are you paying for things? How are you making this work? Again, I understand we have folks from Astoria, there's here, and they've owned their watershed or a chunk of it for a long time. There's Corvallis, the upper Neskowin River, even though it's right on the border of Tillamook County and Yamhill County, it's the water supply for the city of McMinnville. So they've been doing what we call an interbasin transfer of water for quite a while. with our water. However, the deal was well struck years ago with Fish and Wildlife that when they raised the level of their dam, they in return for that, they said, great, we'll start releasing water in the low water flow times a year for fish. So even though they're stealing our water, they're really helping the fish in the Neskowin River, which is great. But more importantly, McMinnville is a good example of a district that manages their watershed. And they manage it rather intensively. They're surrounded by BLM and Weyerhaeuser land, and you can't tell the difference between any of the three of them. They're all managed very intensively. However, they still do it with an eye towards their water supply. It just happens to be that they own enough land up there, it's actually a little source of money for their city water system. So I can be a little envious, but at the same time, we always want to know what are others doing so we don't have to make the same mistakes, and or can we leverage and find out a better way. So right now, we're sitting at the point where we're pursuing a couple of three things simultaneously. So we're working on the timber management plan for the land that we have, and that we want to expand that. Conceivably, it won't be that difficult to expand it to the additional parcels. We continue to talk with the landowners. We continue to appraise where we can afford to do so. And this will be interesting with this next group of landowners, because again, the land is not zoned for just forest land, which makes it a lot easier. So as we've heard, you're going to have somebody come in and say highest and best use. In this particular case, yes, they could do some development. It's going to be a real subject call, a professional call by the appraiser on how much value they then assign to it, and then how much value we want to pay. In the meantime, we also keep talking out with our local public wherever we can. This opportunity is a wonderful one. Continuing to look at our long-term strategy. Like a lot of coastal communities, there are folks in town who have some old, deep pockets, but we've gone to them in the past for simple things like trying to buy our local our golf course when the owner there was selling it, and people said, gee, couldn't we pass the hat and raise the money? And the thinking was, yeah, that'd be pretty easy. Well, it wasn't, but we did go to some deep pockets, and they said, you know, if you show me a little bit of your skin, like, can you raise money? Can everybody here put in $5? Then I will give you $1,000. That kind of thing. So we want to be optimistic. We're trying to do this in a very collaborative, yet capitalistic approach. We want to appeal to their good side of things, and then we also want to say, yes, we will make your wallet